right, everyone ready for this? Today we're gonna dive deep into Nazi Germany, its rise and fall, like the whole thing. And to start us off, I want you to like close your eyes and just imagine this, okay? 1945, Germany. It's the end of the war. There's this 11-year-old boy, Helmuth, and he overhears his dad, who's a doctor, by the way, and like a hardcore Nazi, talking about suicide. The guy's terrified of what's going to happen, when everyone finds out what the Nazis did. All that stuff with the Jewish people, the people with disabilities.
Wow. You start with a story like that, and suddenly this massive historical event becomes like so real, so personal. You think about Helmuth and you get a glimpse of the scars, the damage that Nazism inflicted, not just on Germany as a whole, but on families, on people.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's why we're doing this deep dive in the first place, right?
Yeah.
To go beyond the dates and the battles.
Yeah.
To really understand how this ideology, how Nazism took hold of so many lives, how it came to power, the beliefs behind it, and then, of course, all the horrible consequences.
And we can't forget, the Nazi regime didn't just appear out of thin air. It grew out of specific historical circumstances. It's tied to the aftermath of World War I. A lot of it has to do with the Weimar Republic and how unstable it was.
Right. Germany's loss in World War I.
Yeah.
Talk about a crushing blow. I mean, for the nation's pride, for their economy, the Treaty of Versailles.
Yeah.
I mean, many Germans saw that as like a straight up punishment. Losing territory, having to pay these huge reparations, and then taking the blame for the entire war. You can see how that would create a breeding ground for resentment and anger.
Oh, absolutely. A country that's already hurting from losing a war. Then you pile on economic instability. You've got political turmoil coming from all sides. And then, like the final blow, hyperinflation hits in 1923. Can you imagine being the average person, especially a family that's middle class, and watching their life savings just vanish?
Just gone. Boof.
Gone. It was a recipe for desperation. It got to the point where radical solutions started to seem like the only way out.
Yeah. And you hear stories, right, about people needing wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. When things get that bad, it makes sense that even extreme ideas start to sound, well, less extreme.
That's a really good point. When people feel that desperate, that powerless, they're more likely to turn to extreme ideologies. And Hitler, well, he was a charismatic leader and he was ready to take advantage of that. If you want to understand his rise, we have to look at his background. His childhood was filled with poverty. He fought in World War I, and then he became so bitter about that Treaty of Versailles. All those things, they shaped how he saw the world, and ultimately, they fueled his rise to power.
So wait, he basically took all that anger, all that frustration, and turned it into a political platform.
Exactly. He promised to bring back Germany's national pride, to make their economy strong again. He was speaking directly to what a wounded nation wanted to hear, but it didn't stop there. He needed someone to blame for all of it. And that's when the scapegoating started.
Right, the whole thing with the Jews and the communists.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly. They became the targets. Hitler made them the source of all of Germany's problems.
That's something you still see today, isn't it? It's like this age-old tactic. Find a scapegoat, find someone to blame, and then channel all the fear and anxiety onto them. But how did Hitler actually get people to buy into this whole thing, like really believe it?
That's where the Nazi propaganda machine comes in.
Mm-hmm.
It was truly brilliant, honestly. They had these huge rallies, the swastika symbol, catchy slogans, all designed to make people feel like they were part of something bigger, like they had a purpose, especially those who felt lost, And it all tapped into their deepest fears and aspirations. But under that shiny surface of national revival, there was this deeply disturbing ideology lurking, this twisted racial hierarchy.
Oh, right. You always hear about the whole Aryan race thing.
Yeah.
The Nazis' obsession with racial purity. What did that actually mean, like in their belief system?
Well, they took this idea of race, this pseudo-scientific concept, and created a hierarchy. At the top, you had the quote-unquote Aryan Germans. And then at the very bottom, they put the Jews. They were the enemy, the inferior race. And this wasn't just talk. It was the foundation for all their horrific policies, leading all the way to the Holocaust. It's chilling when you read about the way they used language, these calculated euphemisms to hide what they were really doing. Special treatment, the final solution, all of it was code for mass murder.
Wow. It really shows how language can be twisted, how it can be used to manipulate people and dehumanize entire groups. And then to think about how they used education and propaganda to indoctrinate children. That's just That's just horrifying.
Oh, absolutely. Organizations like the Hitler Youth, they were specifically created to mold young minds, to instill Nazi ideology, to create a generation that would obey and hate. They even twisted the concept of motherhood. Women became these vessels for producing racially pure Aryan children.
God, to grow up in a world where hate is normal and violence is something to aspire to. It's hard to even imagine what that would do to a person, to their sense of morality, even to their sense of self.
That's an incredibly important point, and it forces us to look at the role that ordinary people played during all of this. Because while some people bravely resisted the Nazi regime, many others became bystanders. They either did it out of fear or, well, it's disturbing, but some did it out of indifference.
It's kind of scary to think about, right?
Yeah.
That so many people could either be part of it or just watch and do nothing. Like, what does that say about, how people can be complicit or just silent? Like, how much of that allowed the Nazi regime to actually do all those awful things?
It definitely brings up some really complicated questions
Right.
about individual responsibility and how people conform. I mean, it's easy to judge from where we are now, but we have to try and understand the pressure, the fear that everyday Germans were dealing with. I mean, this was a totalitarian regime.
Yeah. It wasn't just about, like, agreeing with them. It was about surviving. But even knowing that, it's still hard to wrap my head around how all that hate and violence could become so normal. I was reading about this book, Third Reich of Dreams, and it's crazy. The author collected dreams, like actual dreams, from people living under Nazi rule. And it showed how much the ideology had seeped into their minds, even their subconscious.
That's a fascinating example. It shows how totalitarianism can just take over every aspect of life, even your dreams. It really highlights the psychological toll of living under that kind of regime.
Yeah, it makes you think about how fragile our sense of normal is, how easily fear and propaganda can twist everything.
Right.
But even with all that darkness, there were still people, groups, who actively resisted the Nazi regime.
Absolutely. And we have to remember that resistance came in many forms. It wasn't always this grand, heroic thing. Sometimes it was small acts of defiance. Other times it was organized efforts to help people who were being persecuted. Some Germans hid Jews, they forged documents, they even spoke out against the Nazis, risking their own lives, their families' lives.
God, those stories, they're so inspiring. They show you that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can still shine through, that even what seems like a small act of resistance can make a difference.
Exactly. It's a real testament to human resilience. This unwavering belief in human dignity, even when you're surrounded by such cruelty. Those acts of resistance, big or small, they deserve to be remembered. We need to honor them.
Yeah, it's so important to acknowledge those stories, those acts of defiance. They give you a glimmer of hope, in the face of all that tragedy. It shows us that even under the worst regimes, there were always people who chose compassion, who chose to stand up for what's right.
And that's a powerful message, isn't it? It's a reminder that we always have a choice. Even when faced with evil, we can choose to act differently. We can choose to stand up for justice and humanity.
It's a legacy that we can all draw strength from, especially when we face challenges in our own lives. But kind of switching gears here, how do we even begin to process something like the Holocaust, the sheer scale of it? I mean, millions of lives lost, entire communities wiped out.
Right, that's the challenge, isn't it? To grasp the enormity of it, the fact that it was a crime against humanity. But we can't become numb to the numbers, to the sheer scale of the loss, because every life mattered. Each person had their own story, their family, dreams that were just brutally cut short.
Yeah, it's like you said before, we can't let ourselves become desensitized to the human cost. And even though the Nazis tried to destroy the evidence, tried to erase their crimes, people have worked so hard to document and preserve the memories of those who are lost.
Exactly. Those efforts are so important, not just to honor the victims, but to make sure future generations understand what happened, the full horror of it. It's about bearing witness, acknowledging the truth, making sure history doesn't repeat itself.
It's about keeping their stories alive, right?
Yeah.
And making sure that we learn from the past so we can build a better future. It's also, it's interesting, I think, to contrast the darkness of the Nazis with someone like Mahatma Gandhi. He was alive at the same time, but he advocated for peace, for nonviolent resistance.
That's a really powerful contrast. It shows you the choices that were there, even in the face of so much evil. Gandhi's letters to Hitler, even though Hitler ignored them, they're a powerful statement, about compassion, about humanity.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest times, there are people, there are groups who choose hope, who choose to fight for justice and dignity, even when it seems impossible.
And those acts of resistance, they matter. They show us that the human spirit can endure, and that even small acts of defiance can have a ripple effect.
We need to hear those stories. We need to learn from those who stood up to tyranny, because they offer us hope. They remind us that we always have a choice, that we can choose to act differently, to build a better future.
And that's such a powerful message, isn't it? It's not just a lesson from history. It's a call to action for us now, because the fight against hate, the fight for human rights, it's never really over.
So where do we go from here? What can we do to make sure that what happened during the Nazi era never happens again?
That's the big question, right? And it takes effort on a lot of different fronts. Education is key. We need to teach future generations about what happened, but also about the dangers of prejudice, of not thinking critically.
We have to give people the tools to recognize propaganda, to question those in power, to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard.
Absolutely. And it goes beyond formal education, you know? It's about fostering empathy, understanding, about being willing to engage with people who are different from us.
Because to build a world that's more just, more compassionate, we have to look beyond ourselves. We have to recognize that we're all connected.
Exactly. And we have to be vigilant. We have to speak up against injustice wherever we see it. We can't let hate and intolerance take root in our communities.
That's a lot, I know. But you said it starts with each of us, right? So what does that look like in our everyday lives?
It can be as simple as talking to someone who has different opinions. You know, challenging our own biases, being willing to listen and learn. It's about building empathy and understanding. It's about seeing our shared humanity.
Makes sense. It's about building bridges, not walls.
Right.
Focusing on what brings us together, not what tears us apart.
Exactly. And it's an ongoing thing, a commitment we make to create a world where the horrors of the Nazi era stay in the history books, you know, as a warning, but never again as a reality.
It is a commitment. And it makes you think, you know, even though we're talking about Nazi Germany, it feels like there are echoes of that ideology in the world today, don't you think?
You know, it's interesting you say that. It's sad, but you're right. We do see signs of it. Intolerance, discrimination, authoritarianism. It's happening in different parts of the world.
Yeah. It's almost like history is trying to warn us, showing us, you know, what happens when these ideas, these dangerous ideas, take hold.
It's definitely a warning, and it's especially important to pay attention, to be careful when there's a crisis or when things are uncertain. You know, people get scared. They want someone to blame. That's when these toxic ideologies can really spread.
Right. People start looking for easy answers, scapegoats. So what can we do? How do we stop that from happening? How do we stop it from becoming, you know, another Nazi Germany?
Well, I think the big part of it is just being aware, you know, recognizing the signs, the rhetoric, the stories that try to divide us. We have to question the people in power. We have to challenge the information we're given. We have to think critically.
It's not enough to just know the history. We have to actually apply it, right, to what's happening now. Be active in creating a better future.
Exactly. It's about taking action. We can't just sit back and be complacent. We have to speak up when we see injustice. We have to call out hate speech. We have to stand up for everyone's rights. It doesn't matter what their background is, what they believe.
I know. It sounds like a lot. But you said it starts with us. With each person.
Yeah.
So what does that actually look like in our everyday lives?
It can be simple things. You know, talk to people who have different views. Challenge yourself. Challenge your own biases. Be open to listening, to learning from other people. It's about building empathy, about understanding each other.
Yeah. About building bridges instead of walls, right?
Yeah.
Focusing on what unites us.
Exactly. And it's a process. It's a lifelong commitment to creating a world where those horrors from the Nazi era, they stay in the past. They're a warning, but they're never a reality again.
That's a powerful message. And I think it's one we all need to hear. We have a choice. We can choose to create a future where those things never happen again.
Yeah. And in a way, by having these conversations, by learning from history, by working to create a better, fairer world, we're honoring those who suffered, those who were lost during the Nazi era.
That's a really beautiful way to put it. It's like their stories live on through what we do, through our commitment to making sure those horrors never happen again. Well, this has been heavy, but it's so important. This whole deep dive. Thank you so much for taking us through it, through this difficult part of history.
It was my pleasure. And remember, the fight for a more just world, a more humane world, it never really ends. We always have to be paying attention. We have to have courage, and we have to be committed to those values: equality, human dignity.
And to all our listeners, thank you for joining us. Remember, the past shapes us, but it doesn't have to define us. We can create a better future. Keep questioning, keep learning, and most importantly, keep fighting for a world where every single life is valued, where every single life is respected.
Yeah.